Hello, friends. Thanks for tuning into this week's Brain Food. You know, this one I'm having trouble getting recorded. I've tried 3 or 4 times and I'm always starting and having problems and stopping and deleting it and starting over. I'm going to talk about I-bonds today. They're an investment tool that you can use, a savings tool, actually, I should say, savings tool that you can use to get a much higher interest rate on dollars that are sitting in a savings account somewhere that you're not going to need to touch for at least 12 months. So if you watch the whole video, I'm going to walk you through how to basically buy an I-bond from treasurydirect.gov, and then some tips and tricks that I've learned about how you register it legally under the names of the people that own it and different things like that. But what I want to get across to you first is that the simple reason is that we had those dollars sitting in an account that we weren't going to need to touch for at least a year, and we're getting terrible interest rate on those dollars. And an I-bond currently is 9.62%. And I'll talk about what an I-bond is. I'll talk about the components of it and the restrictions on it and different things like that. And then I'm going to show you some screenshots from treasurydirect.gov of how you go through and buy an I-bond and register it properly. And then I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on some things to think about, 3 specific tips and tricks when you're buying I-bonds. But ultimately, this is probably like a 2-minute intro here. You can get a 9.62% rate of return for 6 months, and it adjusts every 6 months in May and November. But if you look at I-bonds, give this a hard look. It might be part of your financial plan that makes a lot of sense for you for the next couple of years. Again, do your own research. Don't take any of this as advice of what you should be doing, because I'm not a certified financial planner. But that's what the topic of today's video is going to be. I-bonds. Okay. I'm going to put up a series of screenshots that I've taken from treasurydirect.gov that are going to help me explain to you exactly what an I-bond is, how it works, and whether it might be interesting to you to buy some of these. So first screen I'm going to put up is kind of a general FAQ about I-bonds on the Treasury Direct website. What is an I-bond? Well, it's a savings bond that earns interest based on combining a fixed rate and an inflation-adjusted rate for a combined total rate of return on the I-bond. So how is it earned? Well, again, that combination of the fixed rate that stays the same for the life of the bond. So whenever you buy it, currently the fixed rate on I-bonds is 0. So there's no component added to the interest rate for that. If you bought your bonds 10, 15 years ago, sometimes it was 0.3%, 1% even. So that would have been a different rate, and it's for the life of the bond. That never changes. So right now, you're not going to get anything for your bond other than the inflation-adjusted portion of the rate. And that's the second part, is for bonds issued from May of 22 through October of 22, the inflation-adjusted component of that rate is 9.62%. So you could take $1,000 and buy an I-bond and get 9.62% for the first 6 months you owned that I-bond. And then there's going to be an adjustment. Those happen in May and November where they adjust that rate. And then whatever that is for the next 6 months, you're going to get that interest rate added to the I-bond as well. So for the period of a year, and remember, you can't sell it for the first year. You have to hold it for 12 months. So at the end of the year, you're going to get that 2 6-month rates kind of averaged together return on your dollars. There's some other things in here that I will talk through about if you surrender it before 5 years, there's a 3-month penalty and stuff like that. And there's some rules on how much of these I-bonds that you can buy, because the government knows that this is a very compelling thing that they are putting out there. So there is a limit of $10,000 of I-bonds per Social Security number. And you can get complicated with this with business entities and paper bonds and all this other stuff. But to keep this very simple, if you have a spouse, if it's just you, it'd be $10,000 a year of I-bonds that you could buy. And if you have a spouse, it would be $20,000 because it's $10,000 per Social Security number. And if you have those dollars, again, just sitting in a savings account earning 0.2%, and you don't need that money for a year, it seems hard, it seems silly not to consider buying I-bonds and getting a much higher interest rate on these things. It's just a great savings vehicle, I think. Again, do your own research. So again, how long must I keep an I-bond? Well, they earn interest for 30 years. That's the longest it will grow. But if you cash them in the first 5 years, you lose the previous 3 months interest. So again, you have to hold it for 12 months. And if you sold it in the 13th month, you're going to lose the last 3 months of interest that you earned. But think about that. If it's currently, let's say it roughly averages out to be 9% for the year. Well, if you lose the last 3 months, that's going to make that roughly 7% or something like that. Do the math on it. 7% still 5 to 10 times more than you're going to get in a savings account right now in dollars that are just going to sit there for a while. And I don't know about you guys, but Tristan and I have certain dollars that we have kept in savings accounts for more than 10 years that are just sitting there for different things, like future projects on the house, future trips, future car purchases as we save up to buy a car. Those dollars are just sitting there. So why not move them into something like an I-bond that can earn more interest instead of whatever the savings account rate is currently? And right now it's so bad. So how do I buy an I-bond? Well, you have to buy them through treasurydirect.gov, the website. You can't buy these through a brokerage account like Schwab or anything like that. And your financial planner probably isn't going to tell you about these unless they're fiduciary and really trying to give everything they can to you advice-wise, because they don't make any money on I-bonds. There's no commission on an I-bond purchase. You buy these directly from the government. Okay, this next part is how are earnings actually added to the value of your I-bond. And this gets a little complicated, so I'm not going to go into this too much because I could talk for 10 minutes about this to fully explain it. But it involves the calendar and when you buy the I-bond. So again, I-bond rates are set in May and November of each year. So if you bought them in May and November of each year, the math would make a lot more sense because the rates are changing at those times and your combined interest rate would match up with the month that you bought the bond. But let's say you buy a bond in a different month. So let's say the rate changed, because the rate did change this month in May to 9.62. You watch this, you think about it, you talk about it, whatever, and you decide to buy these in June. What that means is the start of your I-bond interest in June is going to be 9.62% for 6 months. So June, July, August, September, October, November. And then in December, you'll start getting the new adjusted inflation rate component that was set in November. And you'll get that for the next 6 months. So whenever you get your bond purchased, let's say it's December, you'd get it for December, January, February, March, April, May, and then it resets in May, and you'd get that new rate for June. So whenever you buy the bond, you get that rate for the 6 months. Somewhere in there, the adjustment's going to happen, and then for the next 6 months, you get that next adjustment. So that's how earnings are added to the I-bond. And one thing that I saw that was interesting, because I was kind of watching the value of the I-bonds that we had bought, waiting at each month to see it go up in value. But it didn't. And that's because during the first year and during the first 3 months that you've bought an I-bond, they are automatically taking out the penalty of 3 months before they start adding value to the bond. So what happens is, let's say you bought your bond in January. January, February, March, the bond's going to show a value of like $1,000. And then April hits, and you're going to get the interest added to that bond. So it might go to $1,007 or something like that, because the previous rate was 7.12% or something like that. So anyway, it just starts adding in the 4th month of owning a bond, and then it just adds every month, and then the rate is compounded semi-annually on the payout for that bond. So that's how the earnings are added to an I-bond. I hope I did a good job on that. It's a little confusing. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. The next thing that I want to throw up is, the next thing that I want to put up on the screen is, can the value of my I-bonds ever be less than what you paid for the bond? And the answer is no. The actual worst case scenario is, let's say a couple years from now, the adjustment rate for inflation goes to 0. It can never go negative. But then a bond you bought today, May of 2022, has a 0% fixed rate. A couple years from now, it's got a 0% adjustment for inflation. That means you earn nothing on your bond for the next 6 months. That's the risk. I'm not convinced that that's going to happen over the next couple of years with all the things that are going on with the economy. And again, as long as you've held the bond for 12 months, once you hit the 13th month, you can sell that thing. If you decide that you get to a point where it's a 0% return, combined interest rate of 0%, you sell the bonds and move it to somewhere where it's going to get you more interest. So the important point here is your bond can never be less than what you paid for the bond, which is in the case in some other purchases you could do. So now I'm going to move into how you buy an I bond. This is the screen. I've blurred out our account number and some other things. I did leave, and the selected source of funds, but I wanted to leave the registration information in here because this was one of the mistakes I made in the first place. Originally, when I bought these, I set up a Treasury Direct account for myself, and I set one up for my wife, Trista, 2 different accounts. And each of these registrations I did for an I bond was in just my name or just Trista's name. But if you think about that, we're married, and if something were to happen to me, I would want it to be easy for her to do something with the I bonds that were in my name. It'll go into our estate and all that kind of stuff if I didn't fix this, but this just makes it a lot easier. So I'm going to show you the registration page in a minute. You want it to say, for my situation, Jason W. Terry with Trista D. Terry. There's a couple of other options. It could have said just Jason Terry in here. It could have said Jason W. Terry POD, which is payable on death, Trista D. Terry. So that means, sure, she can cash it out, but I just want it to be 2 owners so that she can do whatever she wants with these bonds, and I can do whatever I want with these bonds. There's no hassles the way we've got these registered. So when you get to the buy screen, you have to set up your registration. You can click add new registration. I'll show you that in a second. The product type is a Series I savings bond. The purchase amount, for example, let's say it's $1,000. And then the source of funds, you plug in, we plugged in our bank information, right? Using the routing number and account number for my checking account, because that's where the source of funds is going to come from. So I made sure I moved some of the money from our emergency savings fund in our savings account into my checking account so that I could then pay into this Treasury Direct thing to buy the bonds. So that's what that select a source of funds says, is it's my bank account that I'd set up in here. And then schedule a single purchase for the day. So I bought those. Couple tips here. One of the things that I did was, instead of just saying, let's say I could have bought $10,000 worth of I bonds all at once, I didn't want to buy all $10,000 of those all at once. I wanted to buy them in increments, so it's $50 or $100 or $500 or $1,000, whatever makes sense for you, so that I could cleanly surrender one of them if I needed some of the money. I didn't want to have to surrender the whole bond. You can surrender a portion of a bond. So let's say you bought a $10,000 I bond, you can surrender $2,500 of that, get that money back, and then the government will continue to pay you on the remainder of that. It just seems messy. So I went ahead and registered multiple I bonds for whatever amount that I wanted to. So I had some options with how to surrender those at some point in the future. So that's that screen. The next screen is, once you've submitted that, this is the confirmation screen. You'll get some code, a letter code for each bond that you buy. It's a security type I savings. Here was the issue date and the maturity date 30 years out. The current interest rate for the next 6 months is 9.62%. And here's the registration. Jason and Trista are co-owners of this I bond. I also went in, that's for another video maybe, and gave Trista, from her Treasury Direct account, transact rights on every one of the I bonds that I bought, and that's reciprocal for both of our accounts. So either of us can sell any of the bonds, the I bonds in our accounts, regardless of which account it's from. All right, so this next screen is the registration screen, and you'll see this confused me at first. By default, I had sole owner checked, and I put first named registrant was me, Jason Terry, and all my information and my tax number. And that's how I registered all of the bonds the first year I did this, because we've done this for 2 years now. And what I realized was, like I told you, I wanted it to be easier for either of us, for Trista or I, to sell these bonds at any time without having hassles. So there's a couple of other options here. There's primary owner and beneficiary, and that didn't make sense to me, so I just skipped it at the time. Let me go over to a description of what those mean. So one owner is what, if I go back, the sole owner is that's the one owner thing. Is the term sole owner means there's one owner. Only one person is named as owner. Only that person may make transactions. If he or she dies, the bond becomes part of his or her estate. Okay? The next one that was on that list was primary owner, which doesn't make sense, because what that really means is that there's a primary owner and then payable on death to a certain person as a beneficiary. So this one would be if I set myself up, back to that screen, there's a second named registrant, and that's required for primary owner and beneficiary registrations. So the beneficiary one is the one that I'm going to talk about next. That's the owner and beneficiary. So only the owner may make transactions. If he or she dies, the beneficiary becomes the only owner, and the beneficiary can't be an entity. And what that means is it can't be, you can actually buy I-bonds through an LLC using the EIN for the LLC, but this kind of thing with beneficiaries and stuff, it has to be actual human beings. So that would be payable on death, like I mentioned earlier, to Trista Terry if I had set it up that way. But really what I wanted was two owners. So the first named owner is the primary owner, the second named owner is the secondary, and the registration uses the word with. So back to that thing that I showed you, I have that detail of the current holding. It showed my registration was Jason Terry with Trista Terry. That means that we both own the bond, and I made sure I set up the rights that either of us can transact on that bond to sell it or do anything with it. So that's the discussion about registration. I know that was a little long, but it was worth talking through really quick. And then I'm just going to put up another screen that I took that was interesting. How much can I cash at one time? You can cash a minimum of $25 or any amount above that in 1 cent increments. If you cash only a portion of the bond's value, you must leave at least $25 in the Treasury Direct account. Redemptions are comprised of principal and interest. So anyway, this gets complicated. That's why I use the strategy of buying $500 bonds or $1,000 bonds or $250 bonds, whatever you wanted to do, so that if we decide, oh, well, we need $1,000 for this trip, I'll sell one bond that's $1,000 or four bonds that are $250, leaving all the other bonds in place instead of just having to do a partial and it doing weird things in the account. So that was why I wanted to put the how much you cash at one time. And lastly, once you do sell them, will I get the question is how you get the 1099 int interest form for your taxes. Yes, the government will send you a 1099 int in the calendar year that you sold any of your I-bonds in the future. So that is how you go through buying an I-bond and how you register it properly and how it kind of works as you're going through the years and how interest is added to it, all that stuff. The tips that I wanted to make sure to throw out there were be sure to consider buying in smaller increments just to make things easier as you're managing the bonds over time. Make sure you register your I-bonds properly, whether you have a sole owner with a beneficiary, or a dual owner kind of situation that you want to set up. And the last one is the order of when you buy I-bonds. So when you buy an I-bond, any time in the month you buy it, you get the credit for the interest of that month. So you could buy an I-bond on the 1st of August, let's say, or the 28th of August, and you'll still get the interest for that entire month. So one of the strategies to use is you could buy the I-bond later in the month if you wanted to, but more importantly is when you know the interest rate's about to change, right? So you know the interest rates are going to change in May and November. So my encouragement would be if you're in April, right, the month right before May, and you know what the upcoming rate's going to be, if it's going to go up, and you have a good rate currently, maybe you should buy your I-bonds in April to get the 6 months of the current rate. So the last period of time, the last 6 months, it was 7.12%. So if I would have bought my bond in April, I would have gotten 7.12% for 6 months. And then in May, the adjustment changed to 9.62%. So it would have been 7.12% from April, May, June, July, August, September. And then in October, it switched to 9.62, October, November, December, January, February, March, right? And then in April, I know it's confusing, but in April, you would have gotten the rate that was set back in November for the next 6 months. So what I'm saying is before the rate actually changes, a couple weeks before that month, either May or November, just take a look at what the current rate is and what the upcoming rate's going to be. And if it's going to be better, or whatever the deal is, get your bonds bought the month before so you can lock in a good rate for 6 months before it changes to the next rate. And again, you don't have to buy it the very first day of the month. You can buy it at the end of the month and still get credit for that full month. So those were some tips on how to do the I-bond thing, making sure you get your registration done right, by maybe smaller increments, and look at the sequence of timing of when you would buy your I bonds, knowing that May and November are when the rates change. Whew. Yeah, that was a longer video, but I hope I got some good information into your hands so that you can at least consider whether or not I bonds have a place in your financial picture. If you have any questions about I bonds or anything like that, obviously you can go to the treasurydirect.gov website to research all this stuff. But if you have a quick question, throw it in the comments and I'll do my best to answer it, or at least give you a link to the Treasury Direct website where it answers that question. And I really appreciate you watching this video. Thank you so much. I do these every week, trying to help you guys out with new information. I'll see you next week.